Hi, thanks for tuning in to the Generative Work podcast with me, Sarah James Wright, exploring all aspects of future business and conscious leadership. This episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Nicoletta Bertoldi, who is a filmmaker and a project manager, who's going to be asking me 3 questions about generative work. Nicoletta and I have been talking about these ideas for a little while. Nicoletta, I know you have a background in both large corporates and grassroots organisations, and you're currently project managing a new housing co-op. But let me know, what was it that's really sparked your interest in generative work?
I think it's some of the conversations that we've had around it, kind of, seeing sort of how within an organization, and also from my filmmaking background, is in terms of how to best sort of lead and how to have a connected team so that everybody is sort of on the same page and you're not sort of forcing that collective energy to get to the destination, that there's perhaps a different way of engaging people, because I know engagement is sort of, I don't know if it's so much of a big buzzword, but sort of not forcing people to engage. It's like an invitation. So I think I'm just really interested in exploring different methodologies, different ways of sort of, allowing people to bring their best selves to the team so that you have a better product, as opposed to just having like a leader, even though I do believe that certain people have strong leadership qualities, but other people have a lot to sort of contribute to the final sort of product. So a lot of one of the things that you were speaking about, so I just found very interesting.
Oh, well, even before we get into your questions, that's already sparking my interest, particularly the idea about not having a single leader at the top. And I think one of the things that we're really keen to promote is that leadership is a quality that everybody can hold and exercise in a really healthy team. But I don't want to get ahead of your questions, so I'll sit back and let you take the reins. So have at it.
Okay, so actually, that sort of like sort of segues quite well into my first question that I have for you, which is what does effective leadership look like in the context of the work that you do?
Well, that's a really good question. It's also a really big question because that embraces absolutely everything. So I might not be able to capture every single aspect of leadership that I would like to see in the world. But I do think one of the issues is, like we've just kind of touched upon, is that leadership for me is a quality that anyone can embrace and exhibit. And actually, I think that enables a team to work collectively together, as you were talking about before, rather than I just feel like, in a sense, if there's one leader, then potentially everybody else switches off a little bit from their leadership, or the purpose of the team gets kind of deprioritized in favor of the power struggles and whatever's going on within that team. Having said that, part of the basis for this kind of work is spiral dynamics, and that idea of the evolution of organizations. One of the things they're really clear about is there isn't one leadership model that works for everyone. So what we kind of posit as a generative leadership model, which would kind of tie in with teal organizations and so on from the spiral dynamics school of thought, that's right for some, but it won't be right for all. So I think that's something to bear in mind, that we're not suggesting everybody needs to conform to one standard of leadership. But the bit that we're interested in is that everyone leads, and everyone leads on behalf of the whole. So that, I think the big difference is that people aren't then leading from a sense of ego, but that's kind of going to help us to move towards that kind of collective intent, collective wisdom that enables teams to work really well and creatively and rapidly together too. Because I think we've all been in unhealthy organizations, generally more than one. And I, in my experience of that, the dynamics, the kind of toxic dynamics in the team just become the thing that everybody's focusing on. It actually becomes more important than the work of the team. So with this methodology, conversely, we really ask people to invest some time, energy, resource into how is the team functioning just as a unit of human beings. And if people are pressured, they often feel like, well, we don't really care about that. We want to just get the team being productive. But in my experience, if you can invest in how is the team as a unit, how are all of the individuals in that team bringing their best, then you start to craft a team that can become actually very productive, because it's kind of cleared away all the stuff that's blocking their smooth flowing and their creativity. And then to get back to the kind of capacities and capabilities of leaders in this new space, it really needs to be something a bit different from the old model of leadership. I mean, you might still want some of the aspects of the old model of leadership. You're going to want to be able to manage a budget and so on, and manage your time. But it's really having some human qualities about checking in with the people that you're working with and accessing your own humanity. I think that's the way to do that, like your own vulnerability, your own parts that there'll be bits that you're good at and bits that you're not good at, because that's life. I mean, one of the phrases I often use is around including incapacity. So if on a given day you're just not on your game, it's actually better to just say, today I'm just not on my game, rather than try to kind of push through, because you're working from that rather depleted place. And that's the sort of space that I think there isn't often in organizations, for people to sometimes not be at their best. Or there's generally a culture in organizations where that isn't welcomed. So people hide that. They hide the bits that they're struggling with. They hide the bits that they're not good at. And from a systemic perspective, that's all useful data that kind of belongs in the system. So it's a bit like you're painting with less and less colors, because you've decided, well, I don't want the red, or I don't want the blue, or does that make sense? So there's a whole host of qualities I think leaders need to have. And some of the more surprising ones, I guess, are about including incapacity, really acknowledging your own vulnerabilities and embracing uncertainty, just being able to say, I don't know. I don't know what to do in this situation. And I think that's often just being able to acknowledge that brings us into this territory where maybe some collective understanding can develop, because we're not expecting one person to have all the answers, but we're sitting in a genuine inquiry about, well, what could happen in this situation? If a team is facing a challenge, if we, instead of sitting down saying we need a solution, you've got to come up with a solution, it's got to be fast because this is business critical. If you could give yourself a little bit more time and space and think, well, what's the question that we really want to answer here? What's the thing that we don't know? What would take us into the territory of our true innovation and creativity? And I think actually it feels as if there isn't time to do that, especially when the pressure's on. But in my experience, that's the only way to really get to a solution that works for not just the team, but the organization and the kind of wider life and environment around it too.
Yeah, it feels a bit more rounded, really, rather than kind of narrow decision that gets made.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because decisions are one of those things that can kind of close down the energy that's flowing. And I work a lot with leaders and teams where it's a decision. The pressure of a decision pushes them to operate in a way that just isn't optimal for that team.
Mm.
And actually the other thing I found, that often the temporal pressures, you know, the deadlines that we've put are kind of self-imposed. We
Mm-hmm.
don't always need, you know, it's like someone's had an idea that we're going to do this project in X amount of time, and then we've worked back and we've said, well, this is the deadline for this.
Yeah.
But actually, if we can have a little bit more flexibility around deadlines, we can tune in a little bit more to the contexts that we're working in.
Mm.
And I think that's another aspect of leadership, to have this systemic understanding that the team doesn't work in isolation within the organization. The organization doesn't work in isolation within its sector or with its customer base. And, you know, we need to pay attention to those larger systems within systems to have a truer understanding of what's going on.
So something you said about sort of leadership, how everybody is a leader, which I agree, you know, for everybody to take accountability for what it is that they do. But in terms of kind of a leader standing up and kind of going, look, I just don't know, or I'm really uncertain about whether or not this is going to work. If you go into an organization and a leader actually said that, say a CEO got up and said that, I wouldn't imagine that people would receive that well, like in terms of going, I just don't know. Because I think there is a part of me that goes, well, if, you know, if somebody's a leader, you want to know that they know that it's going to be okay, even if they, you know, that they're going to deliver, kind of, which I suppose is the stress of being a leader, really, kind of going, don't worry, it'll be kind of, but that vulnerability that you mentioned and that kind of, and I do think like sometimes you can go, I don't know, but know that you can get the answer, kind of thing. But I think people don't want to hear that you're in a place of uncertainty. Do you know, that they want something definite?
I think that's absolutely right. And what you're talking about is the old system. And it's a really good point to make, because with these ideas around working generatively, I don't think there's the sort of thing that you could just pluck something out of thin air and apply it to every situation and it's going to work perfectly. Because like you say, if you're in a system where the culture and the setup, the hierarchy, the whole structure of the organization is on a different model, you're not going to change that overnight, and one person isn't going to be able to change that. And in a sense, why would we? I wouldn't have the conceit to say, oh, I'm just going to come in here and make everything better. You know, it's in that kind of environment, yes, leadership, it's invested in our expertise. You know, leaders are paid for what they know and for the responsibility that they take. And that's how that model operates.
Mm.
And the difficulty with that, like you've said, is that suddenly there's the pressure on that leader to not admit defeat, not admit that things are going wrong, not admit that they don't know. And the difficulty with that is like you're going down a cul-de-sac, you know, your options get narrower and narrower and narrower as that, you know, you follow that train of thought. So if we imagine that scenario, but in a generative organization, let's say we've been able to set up this organization from the start, so that as people join and as the team develops, we know that we're human beings, that we won't always have the answers, and no one person is responsible for making everything okay. We never know whether an initiative, a project, an organization is going to be successful.
Mm.
However much we try to mitigate risk, we can never be absolutely certain.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of more than human pressure for us to be able to control what happens when, you know, like we were talking about the contexts that this project is happening in. If you assume control, it's as if you can control the economy, a pandemic, you know, a financial crisis. We can't control the contexts that organizations operate within. We just can't. So in a sense, if we can admit that, and then we can perhaps engage in them and keep a weather eye on what's happening in those, you know, and allow stuff to move us. And I think the pandemic's been good for that, because you know, it's a very easy point. All the organizations that said, well, we couldn't do remote working, or
Mm,
we don't trust our work, they've had to leap in and give it a try. You know, the environment created a change within the organization. So I think that's one aspect of it, so that we don't set leaders up to be superhuman.
mm,
And then also, if you have set up a team to say it's our collective wit and wisdom that will really bring us the creative ideas that will kind of spur us on, then you actually want to hear from everybody in that team.
mm,
And I think having one voice shout loudest in the old model of leadership tends to shut down all of the other voices that may have something really interesting to say. And one of the fears around that is that, oh, we can't, we can't cope with everyone's opinions. We can't listen to everybody. It would just be chaos. But another aspect of it is that people really need to be empowered to know when they're coming from their own sense of ego and when they're working on behalf of the initiative. And that's a certain kind of developmental maturity that I do think every individual needs to have for
mm.
this kind of collective thread to work really well in teams. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And also that I think what when you were speaking about sort of, that when somebody makes a decision and then it's, you're locked in, and when you were speaking about working collectively, it almost seems like if there's more flexibility in that system, which actually would allow for more resilience, which would
Yes.
mitigate risk a bit
Yes.
better,
Yes.
considering the times that we're living in, and how uncertain everything is.
Yeah.
It's like that is needed. Yeah.
I think that's it, because, like you say, these are uncertain times. That's just how it is. The pace of change in our socio-economic climate has just got more and more rapid,
Mm,
and things like the climate emergency is having such a pressing effect on everything, whether or not we're acknowledging that or not. It's like we just don't have the capacity to control that we might have thought we had in the 1950s or something. We are going to have to evolve as our experience evolves.
yeah. Nicely put. Okay, so I had another question. So I was reading your blog about how to actually, it follows on from what you were saying, was how to unplan, in uncertain times. And but this is and it was, you were speaking about sort of making space, so that your deadlines aren't as tight. So there's space for that. But the mark of success for like a lot of businesses, well, I think a lot of, maybe apart from B Corps, or perhaps non-profits, is profit and optimum productivity, which is they aim for that. And the markers are often decided by data, which I think data is useful, but then I think sometimes, it can be a little bit inhumane, really. Are you looking at a whole new paradigm in terms of outcomes, which informs the process that companies come in and use?
I mean, yes, in a best case scenario, then yes, we would really be looking at the way we frame it is looking at kind of exchange of value differently.
Mm,
So profit is definitely a marker as an exchange of value. Money is one of the things that gets exchanged, that gets circulated through organizations, but it's not the only marker. When it becomes the only marker, then it seems like the whole organization gets distorted into this kind of rather narrow channel. But if we think about, one of the ways that we look at this is organizations are in many ways like the primary unit of human systems now, because most of us live quite detached from our families, even if we love them and have Zoom calls with them and everything. It's the rate of kind of like geographical movement
mm,
around the world nowadays. It means people don't stay in the same places that they grew up. Their families are often distributed. I mean, I think for you the same for me. I mean, mine are all over the place, literally all over the world. um, And so, oh, hang on, I've just lost my train of thought. Finn will have to cut this bit. Sorry.
It's okay. You're speaking about community and how uh, businesses are becoming like a sense of community because we're not connected to our families.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, but I think because we're not connected to our families, and often we're not connected to the communities that we live in, we tend to spend most of our life at work.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you're working from home as a sole trader, then most of the people you'll kind of speak to during your working day will be people related to your work rather than people related to your home life.
Yeah.
And of course, some people find a better balance with this than others, or have lots of friends, or have lots of activities outside of work. But the one thing that most of us can say is that we spend our time at work. We're in an office environment or any kind of organizational environment, and that's where most of our human interactions take place. So I think if we can acknowledge that an organization is not just a profit making machine, but it is also a human system, then we can pay attention to the different kinds of value that can be created within the organization as a human system. So well-being might be a marker that we decide to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And that's becoming a marker, even in some of those profit-driven companies, because they've realized, well, if you run everyone into the ground, they become less profitable, you become less productive. So actually, if we can use well-being as a marker, particularly, mental health now is starting to be understood. It's not just about physical health, but again, something that pandemic has focused us on is our health and well-being. That needs to be kind of one of the values that's exchanged in organizations. And then I think it's also paying attention to what happens beyond the organization, because one of the detractors about that profit-driven sense is that there's all these negative externalities. The cost of their profit drive gets pushed out onto the environment or internally into their workers in terms of stress and conflict. So there's damage being done, in relation to that profit margin. Whereas in a generative model, we'd be looking at the whole thing the whole time. So yes, we would want to be profitable. I want a profitable organization. I want to support other organizations to be profitable, but not at any cost. So it's, the old kind of triple bottom line of people, planet, profit. And then we'd probably add a fourth one around purpose as well.
Oh, that's lovely.
So that there was, that the work was meaningful. Whatever we're creating, that's another value that really needs to be exchanged, that what we're doing is purposeful. It has meaning and value for the people who are working within it and the people who are benefiting from that activity. One thing it might be worth saying at this point, because you mentioned that maybe the only kind of organizations that don't work in this way are things like B Corps or not-for-profits. I'm really keen to dissolve the boundary between organizations for purpose and organizations for profit. I think that's a really unhealthy division, because I actually think all organizations need to have both. Even if you're not for profit, meaning you're not a commercial enterprise, you still need to manage money well. You still need to have a generative flow of resources through your organization. And unfortunately, we've created this dependence, particularly on like the big charities, where they're constantly, or a lot of not-for-profits, they're constantly focusing on where is the money coming from? Where is the money coming from? And it feels as if they're kind of going cap in hand to like the ones with the money. And so there's the ones in the money that can bestow a bit of patronage on these other organizations that are creating a benefit. And that feels very colonial to me. That feels very Victorian to me, that the ones with the wealth out of the kindness and goodness of their hearts, might bestow a bit of resource to people at the other end of the society who might be struggling. And that really reinforces the system. So actually it's everybody's business that everybody is healthy, wealthy, doing well in life. So I think all organizations need to pay attention to both profit and people and planet and purpose. It's like you've got to get the whole shebang, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think there is probably a shift. There is a shift that's happening. I don't know how fast it's happening from an extractive model to a more generative sort of model. And I think even if you went to a large corporate and said, look, your employees aren't engaged, they have so many sick days, you've got high attrition, and this is like we can help you with that. That I would imagine that they would be receptive to it a little bit more than maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago.
I mean, I'd say that's true. But it's interesting with any of this kind of work that, used to be kind of called change management. And I don't like that term either. But it was always like, everyone's like, well, will the corporates buy it? As if, that's the cash cow. Can you introduce this into corporates because they pay loads of money for this kind of work? And yeah, they do pay loads of money for this kind of work. But, we've supported a lot of the people that work with corporates. We don't tend to work with larger corporates, but a lot of the people we've supported do. And what we've seen is that, in a sense, those big corporates will pay a lot of money for initiatives that look good on paper, but actually don't really change the organization at all. And there's a statistic, I forget it now, about, how many change management programs just don't really change anything. And they'll literally invest hundreds of thousands of pounds in it. But I think in that respect, we have to just leave those corporates to be as they are. If they really don't want to change, I don't want to be the kind of person that gets paid a lot of money to come in and change nothing. And even the word change for me speaks to a bit of what you were saying earlier around forcing a team to be a certain way. Most change management programs, you start at A and the consultant comes up with this fixed point of B where they're trying to get everybody to. And then you're just pushing the people, the organization, the culture to come out at a fixed point of outcome. And so this way of working, this generative way of working, and this is also true in other methodologies like Theory U, it's around an evolutionary process. So there's something, like you said, there's been a change already in organizations from 10 years ago. There's been a change in organizations in the last year as the result of the year that we've just had. Our approach is to kind of find what's already moving. Where is change wanting to happen? And so in a sense, you're working with emergence. You're really kind of learning from the emergent future about where is the organization ready and willing to go to. And you can do that by tuning into all parts of the system, but it comes away from that kind of forcing quality. And it trusts that there is always an evolutionary movement within systems, because there is. That's the nature of life. And I mean, sometimes that evolutionary movement might be towards the end of the organization. Perhaps it's had its time. Organizations have a lifespan like anything else. I mean, think about how many people there are at the minute who thatch roofs. I mean, there's a few, but do you know what I mean? It's like the whole roof thatching industry. It's not what it was.
No, it's not. I had never thought of that.
You see what I mean? It's like, everything moves and evolves, and, we need different things. Even who's to say right now what will be the evolution around office spaces? Because if we've all got a taste from working from home and we don't want to go into the office so often, well, maybe those offices will respond to that. We've got a housing crisis. You know, we could end up where we've got too many offices and not enough homes. Well, okay, it's not too difficult to change offices into homes. That would be one potential outcome from the kind of evolution of life during the last year.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's kind of like, what you're saying about sort of not wanting to go into organizations that don't actually want to change. Would you do you know before you work with an organization? Because say for instance, an organization said, look, we want to do this and these are the outcomes that we want. And do you know if that's actually, would you know if that is what's going to happen? I mean, like,
Well, I think we usually do, if we're working with a team, there's a certain amount of preparation work to get into it. And I think if we came across something where it really felt like, I mean, what you've just described is like we want these outcomes. If someone said that to us, we'd probably say we're not the consultants you're looking for, you know. But if a team or a leader within a team is saying, well, we want to find out about this, you know, we want to discover what's possible, that people can talk about the problems and the stickiness and the difficulty within the system, but then part of our methodology is to work with people and really see, are they ready to just explore what that means, what is that telling us? So it's, you start off with more kind of information gathering rather than I don't want to go in and promise that we can get your team from A to B. One, because we might not be able to, or two, it might not be the right thing. So that becomes really a question of, who are we serving? And so, yes, we're in the service of the client, but really we're in the service of the organization, and we're in the service of life itself, what is actually generative for the whole of life. So if the organization is telling us something that the leader doesn't like, we would tell the leader what we think the organization is saying, even at the cost of our own job.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing.
But when we've had to go that far, I guess it depends on the leader. There's been some times where people have just not been ready to listen to that. It's not been what they wanted. And I think we've got better over time about not taking on those pieces of work, you know, learning which ones to say no to. But I think if we can really support the leader to hear what the organization is saying, then things can really start to move. And many are willing, many want the support, because as we've said, it's very lonely being that leader at the top where you're supposed to have this, you know, divine ability to fix everything. It's a lot of pressure.
Especially now as
Yeah.
well. Just everything that's going on. You can just imagine, be like, what's next? What's happening?
Yeah. What the hell? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. No, that's lovely what you said about kind of, serving the organization as opposed to the client. And it just, the impression that I get is that it's less, what's the thing that minimum effort, maximum efficiency.
Yeah.
The quote kind of that's what it reminds me of, that, if you go with what is rather than trying to push against the current,
Yeah.
it's almost more powerful in a way and probably far more productive.
It is. I mean, in my experience, it really is. So we talk about ease, you know, and that's not something that people will ever say, oh, it's easy. Not that it's easy necessarily, but you can find a sense of ease rather than that efforting. And when you are efforting, you're coming from a sense of will. You're back into operating from ego rather than operating from a more integrated place of your being, which can actually serve something wider than your own narrow interests. This comes down to, I think, we can talk about what organizations might look like if they're set up in this generative way, but you can't divorce that from what are the leaders like and what are the people that work in those organizations like. Because if you're going to work in the service of life, you have to understand, what does that mean? What does that phrase, even mean for you as an individual? Because most people are from this very different dynamic about well, I work hard, I get my money, and then I spend my money. It's very much around self-interest.
Yeah, and hopefully we're moving more towards something that's a little bit more collective, really, because it's what's needed, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and I guess the other thing to say about this, which may be an unpopular thing to say, but to me it feels absolutely true, it's not just around organizations that are set up for profit. Because I've worked a lot with organizations that are set up for a purpose,
Mm-hmm.
and people are often working through their own egoic material in those kinds of organizations. And it's not that they want to be top dog necessarily or earn top dollar, but
Mm-hmm.
they have kind of latched on to the need to help something, a cause, a person, a group of people. And actually, they are often overgiving and overworking out of a sense of undervaluing themselves personally. And that happens a lot. And there's a lot of burnout in purpose-based organizations for that reason. And strictly speaking, that is part of our ego.
Mm-hmm.
That's still working from ego rather than working from this deeper sense of who we are and what we can do kind of within our lives. We're trying to fulfill our own need by working on behalf of others.
Mm-hmm.
And it just doesn't help. Ultimately, it doesn't help.
Yeah, because it's sort of like a self-sacrificing approach, isn't it, really? Which I suppose is not. Yeah, you're right. It's not helpful.
It's not sustainable.
Mm.
And the other difficulty with self-sacrificing, I mean, part of what we bring into our model is this idea of everything external is mirrored internally.
Mm.
So everything you are holding, all the truths that you hold as self-evident about yourself on the inside, you are mirroring and projecting into the outside world.
Mm.
So if you say, I have to sacrifice myself in order for me to create a benefit in the world, then that's a bit of a warped perspective. That's not how life works. Life works out of a kind of abundance of generosity.
Mm.
Life is just kind of overflowing. When it comes from that perspective, I'm full up, and therefore I can give to you or my cause from a place of fullness and wellness. That's great. But if you're coming from a place of lack in yourself, all you can really create is more lack.
Mm.
And that feels like a kind of harsh thing to say, because there are so very many people whose hearts are in the right place and who are doing good work in organizations that are set up to create something good into the world. But actually, my belief is that unless you can really shift that belief system underneath that, there's a limit to what you can actually achieve. And the culture is often quite inhumane in those organizations.
But because there's a greater purpose, the idea that kind of there needs to be some, people need to sacrifice themselves to.
Yeah,
what
absolutely. I think most of the big charities that I've worked with, there is this idea that, self-sacrifice is a part of the culture. And if you're not working way over your hours, you're deemed to be not doing enough. If you're not on the edge of burnout, you're not doing enough. And all of the leaders model that because they have all this pressure about being the ones with all the answers.
Yes.
And it stifles people's creativity as well. It's not a good environment to work in.
That sounds very similar to large corporate, really.
Well, it's interesting, yeah.
Driver, though, yeah.
Well, in my experience, what they've done in the last sort of 20 years is try to run large for-profit organizations like corporates.
Mm.
And actually, sometimes there can be more of a humane culture within a profit-driven organization because they can sort of afford to look at well-being.
Yeah.
I do think in a way, though, that's almost run its course. I think people are really aware now that the amount of sort of productivity days lost in illness and stress and burnout and all the rest of it means it's just not worth pushing people that hard.
Yeah, because we're not computers.
Yeah.
We're not.
We're not machines.
Yeah, we're not. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm actually surprised. I didn't really know that not-for-profits could have that environment, really, even when it's purpose-driven.
Mm.
Going on to the next question, if that's okay. It's actually with I suppose it's a non-profit that I'm involved in, the housing co-op, which is building affordable homes, affordable, sustainable homes. And with, I mean, I've discussed it with you before, but the decision making in a cooperative is shared, and it's good on one hand, but then on the other hand, it can really delay progress, within the group. And because there isn't sort of clear leadership, there's people with good leadership qualities within the group, but then if that happens, that person then starts to take on all the responsibility yet again for the group. How would you use a generative approach within this kind of organization? And bearing in mind, it's also, there's external stakeholders that come in, the professionals that do work. Mm-hmm. But then there's also, and people with great skills within the group that do the work. But then there's also a lot of volunteers who don't necessarily have the skill set, or it's not a business in the same way as sort of like I don't know, a normal business would sort of, so it's a community and it's a business.
Yeah. So again, I can kind of say a couple of things that might be helpful pointers, but I'm wary of again, coming across an expert with all the answers, because I don't think there's a kind of product you can take off the shelf that will cure this. Mm-hmm. I think it's much more around developing a culture overall where you do look at the exchange of value differently, all the different exchanges of value, including, your volunteers and what they're bringing. And that you start from the ground up to build a culture where people can offer their perspective in, but they don't necessarily have to be attached to it. So again, that idea of, are we working from our own ego? Is it my sense of self-importance that says, well, here's my opinion on this, and I need to have my opinion matter? Or can we look at, as a collective, what's the right decision for the benefit of the co-op? And, for the people who are going to benefit from that. And so we work with a kind of methodology called organizational constellations that is a really useful tool for setting up a kind of map of those kind of questions. And it uses an embodied process where you can start to actually see what different decisions how they might impact on the various stakeholders. So that's one thing I'd say, there are tools and methodologies around now to support that. And just a couple of other kind of quick tips. The Quaker business method is a really good one to go and look up, particularly around decision making. So one of the aspects of that I really like is that the Quakers, who've been communities and businesses for a long space of time, they've set up to create a benefit and a profit. So they were like the pre-runners of the B Corp movement. And they separated out decision making from decision taking. So the process of making a decision involved getting all the voices, hearing the opinions, tossing it around for a while. And you could have that as a kind of more of an extended process. And then the decision taking was a bit easier, because it's like, well, we've really gone through this. We've gone to the bottom of it. We're really clear about what the impact is. And we've decided to take this decision. And I think if you can invest in the front end, it's a bit similar to what we were saying in teams. Invest in that front end, and then the decision that you make is more likely to be the right one and to be able to hold for a span of time than making a decision quickly and then repenting it at leisure, or whatever that phrase is. And the other aspect of that, which this again relates to spiral dynamics, within Spiral Dynamics, what they call a green organization, where everyone has kind of an equal sense of belonging and everybody has a more or less equal say. That can work to an extent and everyone can feel included. But like you say, it can slow down the process of what needs to happen because we're just trying to make sure everybody's okay all of the time.
Mm.
In the teal model, it's something a little bit different, that somebody might take point on a particular decision. So whoever's taken responsibility around that particular area of work, they might want to genuinely listen to everybody, but they still might take the decision.
Mm.
And people will hopefully will have felt included if you can run the processes around it right, even if what they've suggested doesn't take place.
Mm.
If they felt heard and their consideration has been included, and there's been a really full discussion around it, it might be that you can get broad agreement about, as a whole, we think this is probably the best decision to make on behalf of the co-op and its beneficiaries.
Mm.
So some people might still be a little bit disappointed that their opinion hasn't held sway, but ideally they would feel sufficiently included and sufficiently invested in the whole that they would allow that to go forward.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, these methods that you're sort of mentioning are similar to something that we've been looking in called, I don't know if you know, sociocracy.
Yes.
Yeah, sort of, you have the group when we're doing policies, and the group all comes up with things that might work or not work, and then another working group will go away and sort of work on that and then bring it back. So there's this feedback loop.
Nice.
And it is really interesting because I'd never come across the sort of decision making and when it works really well.
Yeah.
Because it's I think I have natural leadership qualities, so I'll cut through something and go, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, for efficiency. And also, I think I generally sort of make good decisions, but I'm human, and I don't have a crystal ball about everything that could possibly sort of, what the risks are and what could go wrong. And I find with this approach, you do get a fuller perspective, and a different perspective, often from people who are quieter.
Yeah.
When they get given a voice, you'll be like, oh, I never thought of that. And it really informs the decision making in terms of it's more complete.
Absolutely. And I really like what you just said about it's often the quieter voices that are holding the vital information.
Mm.
And in the way things are run at the minute, as a general rule, men speak up more than women, particularly at kind of board level. I'm always working with women that feel they're sat there with information around a decision or a way forward, but because they're not holding it in a certainty, because they're holding it as an inquiry, they feel they can't contribute that at a board level. That I hear a lot. And also that the more extroverted people on the team hold sway because they're more comfortable in that environment.
Mm.
And so I think when you're looking at these different ways of working, you need to really have a number of methodologies that allow people with different learning and communication styles to be able to contribute equally.
Mm.
If people are just less inclined to speak up in a group space, you have to find other ways of weaving their voices in. And really support the kind of collective space to be somewhere that all kind of tones of voice can actually be genuinely welcomed.
Yeah, which would also sort of encourage inclusivity and diversity.
Absolutely.
Women on not speaking up, or quieter people not speaking up, or kind of.
Yeah. Anyone who feels, in whatever way marginalized by the normalcy. It's this idea of expanding what normal is within your particular setup. And as you say, decisions arrived at in that way, they just feel more complete. because we haven't. One of the things I've done a number of times, actually, there's an exercise that I've done in teams like this where they're facing a decision, and I've asked them to rank themselves, literally stand up and rank themselves in terms of confidence about the decision. So if you're really confident about this, you stand up this end. And then if you're really not sure about this way forward, you'll go stand down the other end. And then I just invite them to speak to each other from the different places that they stand in. And often it turns out that the people who feel more confident, they're wanting to push ahead because they have an agenda, or they're worried about time, or they want to be seen to be decisive. And they've missed some of the information that people who are less confident are holding. And so it doesn't mean that you have to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you can have a more complete discussion about, well, what are the bits that could hold us back? Are there things that we've missed if we just barge ahead, just trying to make a decision quickly, that could derail us if we don't look at them now?
Yeah.
So there's lots of ways of doing this. There are lots of processes and methodologies around now for doing this in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, and I do find it, really interesting, and again, the kind of the pressure on being the person that makes the decisions, and kind of it lessens,
Yeah.
so kind of, and also it's not appropriate for this particular organization either, because
Exactly.
it's the idea as well, but I don't know if this is, but I always think, like, if you have somebody who's leading something and something happens to that person, they can't actually lead, it's a risk, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if your entire team is based on that one person, and people do have strengths, like if somebody's a really great leader, they are a great leader. But at the same time, if your entire team is just waiting on that, and that person can't be replaced, that's a real risk, I think, kind of, or in their absence, nothing is happening. In their absence, it's not really, I mean, I don't really love this word because I think it gets misused a lot, but it's not empowering the team.
Yes. And the word that we often use is, in that situation that you're describing, it's deauthorizing for people. They don't feel self-authorized to be able to kind of do their work or bring their creativity or add an opinion into a decision-making process. So anything that helps people to feel authorized and creative, I think, is really important.
Yeah, because it's not a parent-child relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You ideally you want a team of adults.
Yeah.
But you're so right, because when you think about, I'm sure you and I both had several experiences in organizations where there was very much a parent-child, dynamic going on.
Yeah.
And then it just infantilizes everybody, that they stop giving a shit, or, they start messing around because, you just become the child in that dynamic.
They also don't tell the truth.
Yeah.
Which is very useful information, I think, for more senior leaders. Like being able to, for people who are sort of lower down in the rung, to be able to tell people the truth. It's very useful information.
Yeah. But it's interesting. I mean, when you've described it as lower down the rungs, this is why those kind of very hierarchical structures might not be the best places for these kind of engagements that we're talking about.
Yeah.
You have to build a relationship of trust where people feel confident enough to challenge. And that's very difficult in a hierarchy. Very, very difficult.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, nobody wants to be the person that tells the CEO off.
Yeah. I mean, literally your job's on the line, isn't it? If you do that most of the time.
Yeah.
Cool.
No, but this has been really, really interesting. Thank you. And I've just gone away with so much.
Well, good. Well, my pleasure. And thank you so much for coming on. It's been really nice to chat to you. And I really wish you well with the co-op, because, like you say, it's an interesting opportunity, isn't it? I mean, from what you're doing, the purpose of the co-op is really worthwhile, but also it's an opportunity to see, in order to achieve that purpose, how can we create an organization that perhaps operates a bit differently to, the majority out there.
Yeah, and it's creating community, it's kind of like, that's the, I think it's, what the collective sort of creates will be buildings that we live in, and or people live in, but the actual community is the harder part in a way.
Yeah.
In terms of a harmonious community,
Yeah.
we can make decisions collectively. So, which isn't dissimilar to business, really. So
yeah, true.
Yeah.
So, Nicoletta, do you have a website as yet?
What for Starlings we do? Yeah, I can. Do you want the?
Yeah, give it out just in case anyone listening wants to go and look you up and find out more about what you're doing.
Yeah, it's called. We're going to be updating it because we're working on a proposal at the moment. But if they just it's starlingshousing.org.uk. I think I've got that right. Or Starlings. So I'm just googling it. Starlings Housing. Yeah, it's starlingshousing.org.
Starlingshousing.org, and we can get Finn to put that in the episode description.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. Okay, so thanks very much, Nicoletta, and do check out the Starlings website if you'd like to keep track on Nicoletta and the work she's doing in the housing co-op. And see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Bye.
Bye.
So thank you for joining us for this episode of the Generative Work podcast. And what did you think? If you have any questions or comments, it would be great to get your feedback. And if you would like to come on and ask me 3 questions about generative work, we'd love to hear from you. There are links in the bottom of the description for the email and website where you can get in touch. We're looking to build a truly collaborative community for people interested in working generatively, so all ideas welcome. And we look forward to exploring another topic with you next time. Drop us an email if you'd like an update on our next podcast release.